Imagine you're sitting in a parlor in New York in 1885. The fire is low, the lamps are lit, and your maid has just delivered the day's mail. On top of the pile lies a folded envelope, cream paper, sealed with wax. Your name written in looping script. You know before you even open it that it won't be about business or family. It will be something far juicier, because letters in the Gilded Age weren't only for invitations, they were for whispers, for recounting who fainted at last night's ball, for noting who wore too many diamonds, or worse, who wore the same gown twice, for speculating on who spent too long in the conservatory with someone who wasn't their husband. It was gossip by post, the 19th century version of a group chat, only with ink, stamps, and the possibility that your maid might read it first. And it wasn't just letters. Newspapers carried society columns that made or broke reputations. Caroline Astor's guest list was dissected like a state secret. Alva Vanderbilt's ball was whispered about for months. Summer in Newport became less about sea breeze and more about who sat next to whom at dinner. Gossip was not a frivolous pastime. It was a survival tool. It decided who was in, who was out, and who might find themselves quietly exiled from the golden circle. It was currency as valuable as diamonds, exchanged in drawing rooms, scribbled into notes, carried across town by servants, and echoed in the next morning's society pages. So tonight, we'll unfold the letters, scan the columns, and lean in to hear what was whispered behind fans and champagne glasses. We'll walk slowly through the scandals and rivalries that defined the Gilded Age, from the battles between old money and new, to the dollar princesses shipped across the Atlantic, to the endless commentary on gowns, jewels, and flirtations. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. That's the story I'm telling tonight. If gossip was the oxygen of the Gilded Age, then newspapers were the lungs that spread it. By the 1880s, nearly every major paper in New York carried a society page, part social calendar, part surveillance report, part rumor mill. On the surface, these pages were respectable. They announced marriages, engagements, charity events, and the comings and goings of well-to-do families. But just beneath the polite phrasing lurked the drama. Who was missing from the opera last night? Who had suddenly retreated to Newport? Who appeared at a dinner party looking paler than usual? Every line could be read as a clue. The New York Times and the New York Herald reported such details with the straight face of journalism, but papers like Town Topics leaned gleefully into scandal. Founded in 1879, Town Topics specialized in stories that society women dreaded, stories about affairs, divorces, gambling debts, and behavior too shocking to be whispered at the dinner table. It wasn't unusual for families to buy up every copy of an issue just to suppress a particularly juicy item. Imagine being so determined to bury a rumor that you dispatch your butler with cash to clear out the local newsstand. Of course, the best gossip columns were written in code, not explicit, but suggestive. An article might describe a prominent Fifth Avenue hostess whose husband's attentions were unusually distracted at the opera, and everyone who mattered knew exactly which hostess was meant. Names weren't needed. Society could connect the dots. Reading the papers became less about information and more about detective work, a parlor game in which reputations were at stake. And the fear of exclusion was just as powerful as the fear of exposure. To appear in the society pages was to be confirmed as part of the inner circle. To be absent was to risk invisibility. Women pored over the columns, scanning for their names, their daughter's name, the names of rivals. A missed mention could sting more than a snide remark at a ball. This was the paradox of the Gilded Age. Gossip was both feared and desired. No one wanted to be the subject of scandal, yet everyone wanted to be talked about. Silence was deadly. Attention, even scandalous attention, meant relevant. A quiet parlor was worse than a loud rumor. And so, the society pages thrived. They were read at breakfast table, dissected over afternoon tea, and gossiped about at dinner. They gave the public a tantalizing peek into a glittering world most would never see, and they gave society women a mirror in which to gauge their own reflection. Were they dazzling enough? Were they visible enough? Were they safe? The truth is, the newspapers didn't invent gossip in the Gilded Age. They simply amplified what had once been whispered over fans and folded notes, now appeared in black ink for thousands to see. In doing so, they turned private drama into public theatre and made gossip not just a pastime, but a performance staged daily in print. But as powerful as newspapers were, they weren't the primary carriers of gossip. That honour still belonged to the oldest form of communication, the letter. Handwritten notes flew across New York faster than you might imagine, carried by servants or slipped discreetly into the post. Women wrote constantly to sisters, cousins, childhood friends, confidants, scattered between Manhattan, Newport, and Paris. These letters were less about news, about nuance. One letter might recount the disaster of a dinner party, where the soup was served lukewarm and a guest fainted dramatically during the third course. Another might speculate about a young woman's engagement prospect, analysing the length of a suitor's visit and the colour of the roses he sent. A particularly juicy letter might hint at infidelity, written in such careful euphemisms that the scandal was somehow made worse by the restraint. The beauty of these letters was in their ambiguity. Half the meaning lay between the lines, and they weren't just exchanged between close friends. Families maintained entire networks of correspondence, with gossip flowing like a river between city and countryside. A daughter in Newport would write her mother in New York about who had arrived that summer, who had built a larger cottage, and whose champagne had mysteriously run out before midnight. The mother, in turn, would share the letter with friends over tea, adding her own commentary as if she'd witnessed it all herself. Letters multiplied gossip. One incident could be told, retold, and embroidered into legend before the week was out. Calling cards were another medium of gossip, though subtler. Every respectable household kept a silver tray by the door, where visitors left their cards. The absence or presence of a card told a story. If your neighbour stopped by and left her card, it meant she acknowledged your standing. If she didn't, it meant she had decided you weren't worth her time. Women scrutinized those trays as though they were stock tickers, tracking rises and falls in their social investments. She didn't leave a card was a whispered judgment that carried as much sting as a headline in Town Topics. Notes and cards were also vehicles for snubs. A deliberately delayed reply, a curt message written without warmth, or a calling card turned down at the corner, all carried meaning. These gestures were as sharp as daggers, and everyone knew how to read them. In a society obsessed with etiquette, even silence could be a scandal. Of course, the letters themselves weren't always private. Servants carried them, read them, sometimes shared them. Maids and butlers often became the unseen couriers of gossip, spreading stories between households without ever putting pen to paper. If a letter mentioned a flirtation in a conservatory, chances were good that the servant who delivered it had already whispered the same story in another kitchen. And so, gossip in the Gilded Age spread on two tracks: publicly through the booming society pages, and privately through letters and notes that fluttered between households. The letters allowed for intimacy, for whispers too delicate or dangerous for print. The newspapers provided spectacle, drama polished into entertainment for mass consumption. Together, they created a system of communication where nothing was ever truly secret and everything could be turned into a story. It's tempting to compare all this to our own age of instant messaging and viral posts. Only instead of tweets and texts, these women relied on careful script, sealed envelopes, and calling cards left on silver trays. The pace was slower, yes, but the intent was the same: to connect, to speculate, to belong. Because in the end, gossip wasn't just about information, it was about community, a way of weaving people together one whispered story at a time. If gossip in the Gilded Age had a single queen pin, it was Caroline Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor. She presided over New York society with the precision of a general and the subtlety of a diplomat. Her power didn't lie in railroad, banks, or oil. Those belonged to the men. Her power lay in invitations, and invitations in her hands were more potent than stock certificates. Caroline Astor was famous for her 400. This was the mythical number of people who truly mattered in New York society, based on the rather convenient fact that her ballroom could seat exactly 400 guests. Anyone not on that list, however wealthy, however ambitious, was effectively invisible. The 400 was less a guest list and more a constitution, defining the borders of who was allowed to matter. The drama lay in the exclusions. Every season, society speculated who would be added, who would be cut, who might be quietly dropped after some whispered indiscretion. Families waited anxiously for the sound of a carriage at their door, the knock of a butler, the delivery of a cream-colored envelope embossed with Mrs. Astor's seal. A missing envelope could spark weeks of rumors. Was it an oversight? A deliberate snub? A punishment for some breach of etiquette? Gossip filled the silence faster than any official explanation. It wasn't just about who was in the ballroom, it was about what it meant. An invitation confirmed that your fortune was respectable, that your family had passed inspection, that you were safe from ridicule. A lack of invitation confirmed the opposite, that you were vulgar, undesirable, not fit for the chandeliered heights of Fifth Avenue. Mrs. Astor didn't have to say a word. Her guest list spoke for her. The letters written about these guest list wars were almost as legendary as the events themselves. One cousin might write to another, "Did you hear? The Stuyvesants were left out this year. No one knows why. Perhaps it was the incident with the coachman." Another letter might speculate, "The Schermerhorn girl was invited after all." Perhaps her new gowns from Paris softened Mrs. Astor's view. Every household became an amateur intelligence agency, collecting fragments of information and piecing them together into elaborate theories. The truth rarely mattered. The gossip itself was the entertainment, and Mrs. Astor knew it. She ruled not only with invitations, but with silences. To leave someone out was not simply to forget them, it was to orchestrate a scandal. Her quiet refusals were discussed in parlors across the city, giving her more power than if she had shouted from the rooftops. Imagine the thrill and terror of knowing that your family's reputation could rise or fall based on whether one woman's butler appeared at your door. The wars between old money and new money were most visible here. The Astors, the Schermerhorn, the Livingston, they clung to pedigree, looking down on families whose fortunes were too fresh, too industrial, too noisy. But new money was relentless. The Vanderbilt, the Gould, the Harrimans, their wealth was staggering, their ambition unstoppable, and they used gossip like a crowbar, prying open cracks in the old order. Each new marriage, each ball, each charitable donation was another attempt to force recognition, and each time Mrs. Astor withheld an invitation, it only fueled more rumors, more whispers, more stories scribbled into letters and columns. It's worth pausing here to reflect on how absurd and yet how familiar this all feels. Replace the ballroom with a celebrity gala, the 400 with a VIP list, the gossip letters with Instagram posts, and the dynamics are nearly the same. Who made it? Who was left out? Who wore what? Who sat next to whom? The mechanics of exclusivity have changed their costume, but the play remains recognizable. Caroline Astor's guest list wars remind us that gossip was not trivial. It was a system of power. It organized society, rewarded obedience, punished ambition, and maintained hierarchy. It kept old families at the center of the stage, even as new fortunes surged around them. It also gave everyone else something to talk about. Because what good is a closed door if people can't whisper about what lies behind it? And so, the cream envelopes continued to circulate. Carriages arrived at the right houses, bypassed the wrong one. Newspapers speculated, letters dissected, and gossip bloomed like ivy up the walls of every parlor in the city. For Caroline Astor, it was less a guest list and more a crown. And for everyone else, it was a reminder that in the Gilded Age, social survival depended not on what you owned, but on whether Mrs. Astor thought you belonged. If Caroline Astor's guest lists kept society in suspense, then Alva Vanderbilt's 1883 costume ball detonated like a scandalous firework over Fifth Avenue. We touched on this ball in earlier stories, but here we'll linger on its gossip fallout because, truth be told, the party itself was only half the spectacle. The aftermath, whispered in letters and splashed across society pages, lasted for months. Alva had invited over 1,000 guests, all instructed to appear in costume, not just any costume, but elaborate historical and fantastical creations, dripping with feathers, sequin, and imported silks. It was the kind of party that cost millions by today's standards and left tailors, seamstresses, and Parisian dressmakers working through the night to prepare gowns of operatic scale. One guest arrived, dressed as an electric light, complete with a battery-powered tiara that glowed faintly, a novelty so startling that people whispered about it for weeks. Another came as a Venetian noblewoman, her dress embroidered with actual gold thread. Still another dazzled as a goddess draped in pearls. Newspapers described these costumes in loving detail, but the gossip went further, hinting at who looked ridiculous, whose jewels seemed suspiciously borrowed, and whose waistline was a little too wide for the intended silhouette. But the greatest piece of gossip, of course, was not about costume, but about Caroline Astor herself. For years, Mrs. Astor had refused to acknowledge the Vanderbilts, dismissing their fortune as too new, too industrial, too loud. But when her daughter was pointedly excluded from Alva's guest list, Mrs. Astor found herself cornered. The gossip spread like wildfire. Would the queen of society humble herself and pay a call on the Vanderbilts? Letters flew across town, speculating on her next move, and when she finally sent her calling card, effectively acknowledging the family, the entire city buzzed. It was the social equivalent of a monarch bending a knee. The ball itself was dazzling, but what truly made it legendary was this gossip about capitulation. Guests returned home and wrote letters to cousins in Boston, aunts in Philadelphia, friends in Newport. The Vanderbilts have forced their way in at last. Even Mrs. Astor had to bow. Within weeks, the story had traveled across the country, reprinted in papers, embroidered in conversations, immortalized as the moment old money blinked. Of course, the gossip wasn't all about the Astors. Some whispered that Alva had overspent, that her extravagance bordered on vulgarity. Others muttered that the party was less about society and more about spectacle. But beneath the sniping lay admiration. Alva had staged a revolution with champagne, and even her enemies couldn't stop talking about it. In the end, that was the real triumph. For all the jewels and silks, the ball's power lay in its gossip ripple, the way it filled parlors, letters, and newspapers for months, ensuring the Vanderbilts were not just wealthy, but unforgettable. Gossip gave the event immortality, long after the champagne had gone flat. If winter in New York was about glittering ballrooms, then summer in Newport was about marble cottages, which, as anyone who's seen them knows, were not cottages at all, but sprawling mansions modelled after French palaces. Families like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Ulrichs competed to see who could build the grandest summer home, and gossip was the glue that held the competition together. Letters flew back and forth between Newport and New York each summer, filled with updates on who had arrived, who had hosted the season's first dinner, and which house had outdone the others in sheer absurdity. Did you see Mrs. So-and-so's staircase? It's wider than the street outside. The champagne fountain overflowed again. On purpose, I suspect. They've built a ballroom larger than their dining room, which is larger than most people's houses. The houses themselves became gossip fodder. Alva Vanderbilt's marble house, dripping with imported marble and gold leaf, was described as a temple to ambition. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, left guests whispering that its dining room could seat 200 without crowding. Servants who worked these estates carried stories back to New York, who entertained lavishly, who cut corners, who mistreated staff. Gossip didn't just flow downward. It bubbled up from kitchens and servants' halls, carried in whispered tones that traveled just as fast as any letter. The parties in Newport were endless: lawn fetes, musicales, masquerades, yacht races followed by picnics, all staged as opportunities for gossip to thrive. A guest who stumbled after too much champagne might be whispered about for weeks. A flirtation spotted in a moonlit garden became fuel for letters carried back to mothers and aunts across the country. And the rivalries were delicious. Families competed over guest lists, entertainment, even architecture. If one hostess built a ballroom with gilded walls, another installed a mirrored ceiling. If one served champagne, another served champagne chilled in ice carved into swans. And always, always the gossip flowed. Who copied whom? Who outshone whom? Who couldn't quite keep up? Of course, gossip about Newport wasn't just architectural or culinary. It was deeply personal. Husbands and wives spent long summers together in palatial homes, and affairs were difficult to conceal in such tight, watchful circles. Servants whispered, neighbors noticed, and before long, letters hinted at indiscretions that never reached the newspaper but traveled far more efficiently by word. The irony, of course, was that these families built houses the size of castles in order to prove their privacy and prestige. And yet the larger the cottage, the more people had opinions about it. Every marble column, every imported chandelier became part of the narrative, proof either of impeccable taste or of desperate vulgarity, depending on who was doing the talking. In this way, Newport summers became as much about gossip as about leisure. The cottages were stages, the families actors, the letters and conversations the reviews. And for those not invited, the gossip columns in New York provided just enough detail to keep envy alive, because nothing fueled gossip more than exclusion, and nothing symbolized exclusion more clearly than a Newport cottage in summer. Sometimes gossip didn't stay in New York parlors at all. It crossed oceans. By the 1880s, letters stuffed with rumors traveled in trunks aboard steamships, carried by footmen and couriers who knew their employers' secrets far too well. Mothers in New York eagerly tore open envelopes sent from Paris or London, scanning for updates about their daughters married into European aristocracy. The matches were supposed to be triumphs, American money-saving crumbling castles. But the gossip told a more complicated story. Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage in 1895 was one of the most whispered about events of its day. The invitations were formal, the wedding dazzling, but the letters that followed painted a darker picture. Footmen delivered notes written in Consuelo's careful hand to confidants back home, hinting at her misery in Blenheim Palace. Friends of friends relayed gossip that the Duke of Marlborough seemed cold, more interested in Consuelo's dowry than her presence. These letters were copied, passed along, sometimes even read aloud at tea, each retelling adding a new shade of drama. Jenny Jerome's story traveled the same way, though her letters were more flamboyant. Married to Lord Randolph Churchill, she charmed British society with wit and sparkle, but her correspondence to family in New York often mentioned the less charming reality: her husband's volatile moods, the scrutiny of British aristocrats, the endless speculation about her conduct. By the time her letters reached American drawing rooms, carried in battered satchels by exhausted postmen, they had become fodder for speculation far beyond what Jenny herself may have intended. And then there were the smaller dramas. Mary Leiter writing from India after becoming vicereine, her notes filled with details of jewels, ceremonies, and the heat of Delhi. These letters were devoured in America not for their exotic detail alone, but for the gossip they contained: who she entertained, what she wore, and whether her marriage to Lord Curzon was truly happy. What's striking is how much of this gossip depended on the slowness of letters. A rumor that began in an English manner might take weeks to arrive in New York, but when it did, it landed like thunder. By then, new rumors had already sprouted, and the old stories took on fresh twists. Gossip was embroidered in the gaps between deliveries. In that sense, the time lag only heightened the drama. Anticipation was part of the pleasure. So while newspapers reported the facts of these marriages, it was letters, crumpled, ink blotted, sometimes carried by footmen across rainy streets, that kept the gossip alive. They told the real story, whispered from one woman to another, until every ballroom in New York buzzed about whether the Duchess of Marlborough was happy or whether she was simply another pawn in her mother's game. Not all gossip required a transatlantic crossing. Many of the juiciest rumors stayed much closer to home, carried not just by letters, but by the footmen and coachmen who delivered them. Servants, after all, were the unseen lifeblood of gossip. A footman might deliver a sealed note from one parlor to another, but by the time it reached its destination, he had already shared the contents, or at least his guess at them, with another servant along the way. Rumors spread through kitchens and servants' halls as efficiently as through drawing rooms until everyone knew who was meeting secretly and who was taking the air a little too often with someone else's husband. Affairs were an open secret in the Gilded Age. Men kept mistresses, women endured them, but gossip transformed these arrangements into currency. One of the most notorious examples was William K. Vanderbilt, who openly took a mistress while his wife, Alva, continued to play her role as society queen. The gossip grew so loud, whispered in letters exchanged between Newport and New York, hinted at in newspaper columns that stopped just short of scandal, that Alva eventually filed for divorce. It was a shocking move at the time, and the letters that followed her announcement were filled with gasps and speculation. A divorce was a feast for gossip mongers, and Alva's made her both infamous and admired. Other affairs were less public, but no less delicious to discuss. A note scribbled hastily by candlelight, tucked into an envelope, and carried by a coachman could set an entire circle whispering, "Did you hear? He stayed far too long in the conservatory with Mrs. X. She has taken to visiting her cousin rather often, though no one believes the cousin is the true attraction." Each line of ink was multiplied by the mouths that repeated it, until private indiscretions became public legend. Respectable women had to walk a tightrope. They could not acknowledge gossip too directly, but they also could not ignore it. Letters reveal the delicate way they discuss such matters. Mrs. Blank is not quite herself of late might mean anything from heartbreak to scandal. Euphemisms softened the edges, but everyone knew the truth. The vagueness only made the stories spread further as speculation filled the gaps. And so, affairs became less about secrecy and more about performance. Everyone knew, but no one admitted it outright. The newspapers printed nothing, but the letters carried everything, folded, sealed, and delivered by footmen who had already whispered the contents into the ears of their colleagues before knocking politely at the door. In this way, gossip about affairs became part of the architecture of society. It was understood, it was denied, it was endlessly repeated, and every whispered note, every letter carried by a servant through rain or snow, added another layer to the drama. It's impossible to talk about gossip in the Gilded Age without talking about fashion, because clothes were never just clothes. A gown wasn't simply fabric, it was a declaration, a weapon, a headline waiting to be written in ink or whispered into a letter. In a world where society judged you before you even spoke, what you wore was often the most talked about thing about you, and the gossip was merciless. At every ball, there was as much speculation about the gowns as there was about the dancing. Who wore Parisian couture from Charles Frederick Worth? Who dared to repeat a dress from last season? Who spent thousands on diamonds? And who, horror of horrors, appeared in paste? Guests smiled, but their minds were tallying, and by the next morning, the gossip had already taken flight. Here's how it worked. A woman at the opera might lean close to her friend and mutter, "Did you see her bodice? A little snug, don't you think?" That comment would be relayed in a letter that very night. Ink scratching across paper, the candle burning low, the words written as if they were state secrets. A maid carried the note across town in the morning, tucked discreetly among respectable correspondence. By afternoon, another household was reading about the too tight bodice, and by evening, 3 parlors were debating whether the diamonds had been real. Gossip had wings, and in the Gilded Age, those wings were lined with lace and postage stamps. Jewels carried just as much weight as gowns. A diamond necklace was less a piece of jewelry and more a press release. If it was large enough, people assumed you had married well. If it was rumored to be fake, the whispers were almost impossible to silence. Servants who polished the pieces often knew the truth, and gossip spread from kitchens as efficiently as it did from drawing rooms. One maid might remark while scrubbing a necklace, "Paste, of course, though she wears it as if it were Tiffany's finest." That single comment, repeated and embroidered as it passed through kitchens and corridors, could destroy the luster of even the brightest stone. And then there were the great costume balls, where gowns were designed not only for beauty but for shock value. Guests dressed as queens, goddesses, even electric lights. Newspapers described these costumes in theatrical detail, but the letters that followed were far sharper. Lady so-and-so looked absurd in feathers taller than she was. Mrs. X's dress was so heavy she could hardly dance, though she insisted she was comfortable. These were the reviews that mattered, not written by fashion critics, but by friends, rivals, and bored cousins who took delight in sharpening their pens. There was also gossip about extravagance. Some whispered about families spending more on a single gown than others earned in a year. Others sneered at what they called vulgar display, meaning too many sequins, too much gold thread, or simply the wrong shade of silk. Old money women took particular pleasure in mocking the outfits of new money rivals. A Vanderbilt gown might dazzle the room, but behind fans and in letters written the next morning, Astor loyalists called it garish, even desperate. Fashion gossip wasn't only about ridicule, it was also about hierarchy. Letters preserved details like catalogues of worth. She wore emeralds the size of walnuts. Her train was 20 feet long and required 2 maids to carry. She ordered 3 gowns for the season from Paris, while I have heard Mrs. So-and-so ordered 6. These lists were less about admiration than about comparison. Fashion was scored like a game, and gossip was the scoreboard. And of course, the most whispered about offense of all, repetition. To wear the same gown twice in the same season was practically social suicide. Letters carried these offences gleefully. She wore the ivory gown again, though surely she must know everyone remembers. Imagine the tension of standing in front of a mirror, wondering not if your dress was beautiful, but whether someone might recall seeing it 6 weeks earlier. That memory would turn into a letter, and that letter into a rumor, and that rumor into a humiliation repeated at the next dinner table. The irony is that most of these women adored their gowns. Many kept scrapbooks of sketches, swatches of fabric, and photographs of themselves at balls. But the pleasure of fashion was always doubled by the risk of gossip. Beauty was admired in the moment and dissected afterward, often with far more cruelty than praise. So when we picture the glittering chandeliers and the shimmering dresses of the Gilded Age, we should also picture the ink stains on letters, the servants carrying folded notes across town, the cousins in distant cities reading about a too tight bodice or a suspicious diamond. Fashion was theatre, gossip was the review, and no gown, however beautiful, was safe from the sharp edge of a pen. Some gossip wasn't about gowns, jewels, or even scandalous romances. Some of it was structural, the constant tug-of-war between old money and new. New York in the Gilded Age was a battlefield, and the weapons weren't cannons or contracts, but whispers. The Astors, Schermerhorns, and Livingstons clung to their sense of pedigree like armor. Their families had been established for generations, their fortunes built quietly on land or fur trading, their reputations cultivated as much by silence as by display. Across town, the Vanderbilts, Goulds, and Harrimans stormed onto the scene with fortunes made in railroads, oil, and finance. Their money was louder, their houses bigger, their jewels shinier, and old money hated them for it. The gossip reflected this divide. Letters between old society women often contained dry, cutting remarks about the newcomers. Mrs. Vanderbilt has built yet another house, though it has the unfortunate air of a railway station. Or, the Gould children are said to be studying in Paris, though I imagine they are learning manners more than French. These were written in elegant cursive on thick stationery, folded crisply, sealed with wax, and carried by footmen who sometimes knew more of society's divisions than the women they served. New money families fought back with their own gossip. Alva Vanderbilt's circle whispered that Mrs. Astor's great mansion was not nearly as fashionable as the new marble house. Letters boasted of Paris gowns, European travels, or philanthropic donations that outshone those of the old guard. And while newspapers remained discreet, the letters that crossed Fifth Avenue told the real story. Society was cracking in two, and every whispered remark was another fissure. The rivalry even spilled into architecture. Old families preferred restraint, red brick houses, dignified and severe. New families built palaces dripping with marble and gilt. Letters traded judgments about these facades with as much venom as about gowns. Their new cottage has rooms so large they echo when empty. Perhaps that is why they invite so many guests, to fill the silence. It's almost comic how much energy was spent on gossip that masked real fear. Old money worried they were losing relevance. New money worried they would never be accepted. Gossip became the tool both sides used to keep the other off balance. A footman delivering a note might be carrying more than news of a dinner party. He might be carrying a cutting remark about someone's heritage, destined to be repeated in 5 different parlors before dusk. And so, the feud between old and new played out less like open conflict and more like a never-ending string of rumors. Who was vulgar? Who was desperate? Who was on the rise? The letters said it all. And while the houses grew taller and the fortunes larger, the real battles were fought in ink, over tea, with gossip as both shield and sword. Not all gossip was born in ballrooms glittering with chandeliers. Some of it was nurtured in the more respectable settings of philanthropy, though respectable hardly meant free from drama. Charity balls, subscription galas, and fundraising dinners became stages where generosity was displayed, reputations were polished, and gossip was inevitable. On paper, these events were noble, raising money for hospitals, orphanages, schools. But everyone knew they were also tests of social standing. Who donated generously? Who gave too little? Who conspicuously declined to attend? Letters written after charity events often carried lists of donations, written with the precision of accountants but the tone of gossips. Mrs. X gave $5,000, though one might have expected more from her fortune. Or the Schermerhorns were absent entirely. Perhaps their finances are not so secure as they pretend. The seating arrangements themselves became a source of endless speculation. Who sat at the host's right hand, the position of honor? Who was relegated to the farthest corner table near the door? Guests noted these details, wrote them into letters that were carried across town in neat stacks of mail, and by the next day, entire families knew their place in the invisible hierarchy. Subtle snubs were delivered as carefully as invitations. A hostess might delay acknowledging a guest's donation, or fail to praise her gown, or seat her inconveniently far from the center of the room. These slights were invisible to outsiders, but to insiders, they were thunderclap, and the letters that followed, folded carefully, sealed with wax, handed to a footman who trotted across town in the rain, captured every nuance. Mrs. Astor barely greeted Mrs. Vanderbilt last night. I fear it is a sign of another quarrel. Charity itself was gossip fodder. A family that gave lavishly might be accused of trying to buy respectability. A family that gave too little was whispered about as miserly. Even the way a check was presented, in person, with a flourish, or quietly, by messenger, shaped reputations. In a society where appearances mattered more than sincerity, generosity was never simple. It was another costume, another performance, another story to be dissected over tea. Even the charities benefited from the gossip. Newspapers often published lists of donors, knowing full well that society devoured them. Families might grumble at the exposure, but secretly they knew a donation was wasted if no one whispered about it. And so, philanthropy became another form of theatre, its drama staged not in opera houses, but in ledgers and letters. The irony is that for all the talk of benevolence, these events often did little to bridge the gap between rich and poor. They were more about the rich talking to themselves, measuring each other, competing for prestige, and writing letters afterward to confirm who had triumphed. For the poor, the donations may have been lifelines. For the rich, they were headlines, and so gossip wove itself even through charity. A dinner meant to raise money for a hospital might raise just as many rumors about fortune, rivalries, and snubs. The chandeliers glittered, the music swelled, the checks were written, and then the real event began. As gossip walked out the door in the pockets of footmen, tucked into envelopes, carried across town to fuel the next day's letters. Not all gossip sparkled with diamonds or glittered beneath chandeliers. Some of the most whispered about stories in the Gilded Age were softer, sadder, and written in ink that almost trembled on the page. These were the stories of health, or rather, of sickness. Society women were under relentless pressure to appear graceful, polished, and endlessly social. Yet exhaustion, anxiety, and depression crept in like uninvited guests. Doctors of the day called it female complaints, or nervous disorders, vague phrases that covered everything from migraines to heartbreak. And while no one spoke of these ailments openly at a dinner table, they were discussed endlessly in letters. A cousin might write, "Mrs. Blank has taken to her bed again. The doctors prescribe rest." Another note might mention, "It is said she is traveling to the country for her health, though I suspect it is something more delicate." Footmen carried these letters across town, and with each delivery, another family leaned in, whispered, speculated. A woman's absence from the opera became not just a personal matter, but a topic of conversation for half of New York. The irony is that much of this gossip wasn't cruel. It was curious, sympathetic, sometimes even tender. But sympathy could turn quickly to scrutiny. Was a woman fainting because she was overworked, or because she was scandalized? Was her illness real, or merely an excuse to retreat from society after some indiscretion? The ambiguity made the gossip irresistible, and servants carried the stories just as efficiently as doctors. A maid dismissed from one household might explain that her mistress had taken to fainting each afternoon. By the time she was employed across town, that detail had become part of a larger story. Coaches rattled with whispered conversations, letters multiplied in careful script, and soon a woman's rest cure was discussed with more intensity than her diamonds ever had been. In this way, health itself became a form of theatre. Illnesses were woven into the social fabric, spoken of with the same delicacy as affairs or fortunes. They were personal, yes, but they were also public, because nothing, not even sickness, was free from the gossip machine of the Gilded Age. And that is the story I wanted to tell you tonight. The Gilded Age sparkled with chandeliers, diamonds, and endless parties. But beneath it all, what truly kept society alive was gossip. It travelled in society pages, folded letters, calling cards, and whispers carried by footmen and maids. It told the world who mattered, who stumbled, who sparkled too brightly, and who failed to sparkle enough. It was a survival tool, a performance, and perhaps a kind of entertainment. Because in a society built on appearances, gossip was both the glue and the solvent, binding people together and just as easily pulling them apart. So tonight, as the last letters are folded and the chandeliers finally dim, perhaps you can set your own thoughts aside. The gossip of the past is written and done, and your own stories, whatever they are, can wait until tomorrow. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, this is your moment to let go. Close your eyes, rest, and sleep well. Good night. Script written by Clara Finch, because some stories still deserve a soul.